Oops. Sorry, Bill, I accidentally promoted you to panelist. I'm going to put you back in the audience. To members of the public who are filtering in, we're just going to give people a couple more minutes, and then Chair Reed will get us started for today. It looks like we're holding steady at 13.
Okay. So let's open the meeting. Scott, do you want to do a roll call?
Happy to. Commissioner Carr.
Here.
Commissioner Ocaña.
Here.
Commissioner Diaz.
Here.
Commissioner Davis.
Here.
And Chair Reed.
Here. Okay, I'll start out with some instructions for the public. The members of the public can join the meeting through the Zoom app or by calling in on their cell phone. You will be given the opportunity to provide public comments. So take your time to locate the raise your hand feature on the app, or you can use the Alt and Y keys together on your keyboard. If you are calling in, press *9 to raise and lower your hands. And we're here today to review PLP 20-0018 rezoning sites for housing, the draft environmental impact report. But we'll start the meeting with public comment that is not on the agenda. So please raise your hand if you would like to speak on something that's not on the
Very quickly, Chair Reed, would you like to do a pledge today?
Oh, I missed that. Very quickly, let's do a pledge. Commissioner Diaz, would you like to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Sure. Okay. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States
of
America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, with that.
I'll be glad when that stuff is over.
And then I do have a little bit of Board of Supervisors happenings to share with the Planning Commission. So this on the 18th, so this last week, there were a couple items that went forward. One was the cannabis ordinance update that the Board of Supervisors decided to reject the Planning Commission recommendation, and so that ordinance will not be going into effect. And there was also direction given to staff to begin the process to determine what a comprehensive ordinance update and EIR would look like. So that's all there is to report on that at the moment. The board also had a workshop on a county tree ordinance with direction to staff. So that is something that staff received and will be one day coming to the Planning Commission to discuss further. But more immediately, they're kind of laying the foundation for public outreach and planning for future public meetings. So,
Through the chair, could I ask a quick question on the tree ordinance? Do you have any sense of the timeline for when that may come forward to the commission and board?
It is currently on the Board of Supervisors item of significant interest calendar for a workshop in October. So I would expect, sometime after October for the formal Planning Commission.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, so maybe now we can hear from the public on items that are not on the agenda. I see one hand raised. Scott, will you?
Yeah, Rick Savell, you should be able to go ahead and unmute yourself. Rick, I can see that you've unmuted yourself, but I can't hear you speaking at the moment. So I would recommend that maybe we come back to items not on the agenda after our item today to give Rick another chance to speak.
Okay, that sounds good. Hang in there, Rick. So today we're going to review the draft EIR. And
Commissioner Davis is waving her hand.
Oh, yes, sorry. You're muted.
Sorry, I don't have the agenda in front of me, but is there a point when we'll be doing commissioner announcements?
Why don't we do commissioner announcements now as we begin this agenda item?
Thank you.
Okay, Pam?
Yeah, I would like to make an announcement. So I just want to let folks know that I am going to be retiring from the Planning Commission after the June 3rd meeting. So I have this meeting, and June 3rd is going to be my last meeting. So I just wanted to say it's been a great 12 years, and this has kind of been in progress for a little while. I'm sure that Supervisor Hopkins will be making her own announcement about who the replacements are. I'll leave that to her. But anyway, I just wanted to say it's been wonderful. My tenure here has been great, and I'm going to miss all of you. And this whole experience has been very enriching for me. So thank you.
Oh, thanks for that, Pam. You will be missed.
Yeah, we're going to miss you, Pam.
Thank you.
Well, I'm sure that people look forward to telling embarrassing stories about your tenure on the third committee.
Well, and I was thinking today that if the planning agency ever resumes, the post planning agency meetings, I'd be happy to host.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Any other commissioner announcements or disclosures? I will announce that I did review some of the sites that we're going to be talking about today, the Fengrove and Petaluma sites. Commissioner O'Connell?
My only disclosure is that I had a conversation with Planner Bellucci, and so I'm not sure if that's a disclosure, but I did ask her to kind of go over a couple of clarifications for me from the report.
Great. That's a good reminder. I also spoke with Planner Bellucci. And then today, as I understand it, we're going to receive public comment on this item, and that staff will continue to receive public comment through June 18th, when they will close that window. And then they will take that back and prepare the final EIR for our review in September. At that time is when we will be deliberating and making our own comments. So I understand today's meeting is primarily to listen to the public comments. We have received quite a few emails and the like, so we'll hear more today. So maybe we should begin with our staff report.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen clumsily, so bear with me a second. Okay, is everyone seeing the presentation and not my notes? Okay, thank you. Chair Reed, thank you for the introduction. My name is Nina Bellucci. I'm the project planner for this project. We're here to talk about the rezoning sites for housing project and the associated draft environmental impact report. And first, I'll introduce our staff and consultant team, talk about the purpose of the hearing. We'll go through the project description, some details on the EIR. We'll discuss how to submit comments on the, how to submit comments on the EIR, and then next steps for the project. So first of all, I'm Nina Bellucci. Chris Sepler from our Natural Resources Division is also here. Brian O is our Comprehensive Planning Manager. We have our consultant team on the line, Rincon Consultants. We have Darcy Kremen, Project Manager, and Catherine Green. Darcy will be talking about the environmental review process and the findings of the draft EIR once I am finished with my piece, which is the project description. So in simple terms, this project for which this environmental impact report was done would rezone up to 59 sites in general plan designated urban service areas throughout the unincorporated county. And where necessary, it would also amend the general plan and area plan land use and density for identified sites. It would implement general plan policies to identify urban sites for housing and would add sites to the county's general plan housing element site inventory for the next cycle. And because this project is part of the housing element update, I will go through a few basics about the housing element, the regional housing needs allocation, and how this project fits into those things. The site inventory is a required element or required component of the housing element, which itself is a required element of the general plan. It's updated on an 8-year cycle, which is a little bit shorter cycle than most general plan elements. And all Bay Area cities and counties are updating their housing elements now because we're all on the same schedule. We're coming to the end of a cycle, 2022. And so housing elements have to be certified, 2023. Housing elements have to be certified by the beginning of 2023. And the housing element is based on a principle that all cities and counties in the state have to plan for their projected housing need. It's how the site inventory is how we show that there's enough land within our jurisdiction zoned for housing to meet our share of the regional housing needs allocation, or RHNA. Sites have to meet very strict criteria for inclusion in the inventory. They have to be available with realistic potential for development, and there's even stricter criteria for sites to count as affordable. The RHNA is the number of new homes that every city and county has to plan for. The state assigns a number of homes to the region, and the regional planning bodies assign a share of that to each jurisdiction. In our case, that regional planning body is the Association of Bay Area Governments. And together with the Housing Methodology Committee, they developed a methodology to divide up the region's share to each jurisdiction. So for this cycle, the region's, the number that the region had to plan for was over 440,000 new homes. Unincorporated Sonoma County and the cities within it have to plan for over 14,000. Within that, the unincorporated county alone has to plan for nearly 4,000. That's nearly 8 times our previous share of 515. So this represents a very big challenge for the county. So as I mentioned, this project would rezone up to 59 sites around the county, and you may be wondering how we got to those 59. 2 years ago, we asked the public to help us identify underutilized sites around the county that would be appropriate for housing. And we got nearly 200 sites nominated. And based on the requirements that criteria shown here, we identified 59 that were eligible for further analysis. So those are what were included in this environmental impact report. So what would approval of the project actually mean? It would mean that we would change zoning on identified sites to either medium density residential or R2 zoning district, or on commercial sites, we'd add the workforce housing combining zone, which is a fairly new zoning combining zone that allows housing on commercial or industrial zoned land. It doesn't change the underlying use of the property or the underlying zoning. So a site that's zoned LC would stay zoned LC, but it would have the added WH designation that allows housing to be built there in densities that maybe the base zoning wouldn't have allowed. Sites are in 11 sub areas around the county. They're listed here. And we have not developed any recommendations to either the Planning Commission or the Board of Supervisors on which sites are to be rezoned. We're going to be developing those recommendations in the coming months while we do public outreach and get stakeholder input on which sites are most appropriate for rezoning. The project objectives are the outcome that the project would achieve if implemented. And these objectives have significance in CEQA because they're the basis for identifying and evaluating alternatives. So the objectives, to summarize what's on this slide, it would add sites to the county's housing element site inventory, encourage development of higher density housing around the county, increasing the overall availability of housing, provide opportunities for housing development in urban areas where jobs, transit, services, and schools are easily accessed, and implement general plan policies that focus growth in established communities and urban areas. And Darcy will talk more about the CEQA process and the alternatives right now. And I believe that Darcy is able to present. I think I hear her.
Yeah, I'm here. Thanks,
Okay.
Nina.
So I'll mute myself and you can just
advance the
next
slides.
slide,
Excellent. All right, next slide. So yes, as Nina said, I'm Darcy Kremen with Rincon Consultants. First, we always start with the what is CEQA. It is the California Environmental Quality Act that was enacted in 1970. It is first and foremost a public disclosure and input process. So it's all about giving information to the public and the decision makers about the potential environmental effects of a proposed project. Secondarily, and just as important, we do try to minimize, avoid, or reduce environmental impacts to the extent feasible. And after the process is finished, we're certifying an EIR. The Board of Supervisors must adopt a mitigation monitoring program that would require mitigation measures to be implemented. Next slide. This is the environmental review process of how this goes. We are here in the county solicits comments on the draft program EIR. You can see there's multiple steps. It's quite a lengthy process. And after we hear comments on the draft EIR, we take those comments and we do produce a final EIR with response to comments, some errata, and any other information we need to include in the final so that a decision can be made on the project. Next slide. So EIR timeline. We filed a notice of preparation for the EIR on March 11th, 2020. So a little bit ago. We held a virtual scoping meeting on May 6th, 2020, because everything had shut down at that point. The scoping comment period was from March 11th, 2020 to May 14th, 2020. So we accepted comments on the scope of the draft EIR at that time. And then, as you know, the draft EIR was published on April 19th, 2021, and it is now available for your viewing pleasure at that website. And we are in the middle of the public comment period on the draft EIR, which goes until June 18th, 2021. It is a 60-day comment period. Next slide. An important part of our EIR analysis is to analyze alternatives. Next slide. So we analyze the mandatory no project alternative. What would happen if nothing changes? So that's alternative 1. We analyzed alternative 2, which is a workforce housing combining district on all the sites. And part of that was to reduce impacts from VMT, vehicle miles traveled. We will get into that, but that, again, to reduce, avoid environmental effects. We looked at that alternative. And our third alternative was to look at fewer potential sites. And that alternative removed 6 sites from our analysis because of more significant environmental effects on those sites. An EIR analysis of alternatives has to do 2 things. It must try to meet most of the project objectives and reduce or avoid environmental effects. So those 2 alternatives were crafted so that we could try to find ways to reduce or avoid environmental effects of the project. In our analysis, we did find that alternative 3 was the environmentally superior alternative. That doesn't mean that that's the one that gets chosen. That just means that this one has the fewest impacts of all of the alternatives, including the proposed project. Next slide. So what did the EIR find? Well, quite a bit. It's a big document. We encourage you to read it. Next slide. We analyzed 20 environmental resource topics, and this is the list of all of the areas that we analyzed. The resources that are underlined on this list need mitigation measures to reduce impacts to what we consider to be less than significant, so they're below the threshold of significance. The resources that are bolded here with the asterisk, those are the resources that were found to have significant unavoidable impacts, meaning that even with the implementation of mitigation measures, the impacts would continue to be significant and could not be brought to that level. Next slide. So I'll walk you through, this is a very brief overview of the mitigation measures that are proposed in the document. In the aesthetics section, we have 5 mitigation measures that are proposed, mostly on the design, the structure, the material, vegetation screening, and then some lighting recommendations for those future projects. Now remember, this is a programmatic document, so these are programmatic mitigation measures because we don't know until a development project comes into the county exactly what it's going to look like, and not all mitigation measures will apply to every single project. So certain mitigation measures specifically say this is for this site, some are blanket and apply to all the sites. For air quality, these are for construction mitigation only, and this is because of the construction equipment and things like, reduce idling time and try to use tier 4 engines, which makes it cleaner. So those are the things that should be implemented. Next slide. So we found biological resources. Again, some of these are site specific. Some of them are very much on species specific, but there are 17 mitigation measures depending on the project site, depending on the resources. The very first one that would happen with any project that's applied, that's an applicant comes in with it, we would do a biological resource screening and assessment so that individual site, we know exactly what's happening with the biological resources on the site. Not every project is going to need a western pond turtle avoidance and minimization measure, for instance. Next slide. Here are the remaining biological mitigation measures. Again, American badger, depends on the site. Jurisdictional delineations, that's definitely not for very many sites. So it's very, very specific on these 59 individual sites. Next slide. For cultural resources, again, it starts very programmatic. It starts with the looking at the individual sites. So these are all the archaeological mitigation measures. again, we would look at the sites, have a phase 1 archaeological resource study done, and then depending on the results of that, there could be many more steps if it's a highly sensitive archaeological site, which we won't know until someone goes and does the investigation on that particular site, all the way to unanticipated discovery, which is a very standard mitigation measure. If you discover something, there are steps you have to take at that point during construction. Next slide. In geology and soils, the mitigation measures are paleontological resources, which is now in the geology and soil section. It used to be in cultural. And this, again, it's very site specific. It depends on the paleontological sensitivity of those particular sites. And these are some of the things that would occur depending on how sensitive those sites are. Next slide. For noise, we have the first 4 mitigation measures are specifically during construction to minimize, reduce noise and vibration impacts, typically to nearby adjacent structures and noise sensitive resources. And then the last 2 are during operation to make sure that, the last 3, to make sure that the noise is reduced to the extent feasible. In population and housing, we have a mitigation measure to provide replacement housing, again, depending on what's being lost on that site, which we won't know until the time that the development application comes into the county. Next slide. Tribal cultural resources. We have, again, another list. It's very site specific, but it does start with consulting with the tribes. When a project comes in to the county, there will be tribal consultation required. And then the other steps will depend on that consultation. And finally, utilities and service systems. That is based on water and wastewater provider capacity. And again, very site specific. We will find out when the project comes in, depending on the size of the project, what's required at that time. We'll make sure that the capacity is there. Next slide. So the resources that we found to have significant and unavoidable impacts are these. So we have, go back, 2 more back. There we go, cultural resources. So let's start with architectural history. The reason this is significant and unavoidable is that we don't know when these projects are going to be developed. They could be developed tomorrow, they could be developed in 10 years, and we don't know if there's going to be a structure on the project site that is an eligible historic structure. So what we would have the applicants do is perform an architectural history evaluation of any buildings they wish to demolish to see if they're eligible at that time. And then if they are, there would be some mitigation. Now, under this particular resource, if you continue to demolish a historic structure, it is considered significant unavoidable. So you can take pictures of it and such, but you need to call it significant unavoidable because we just don't know what's going to happen with these sites in the future. Next slide. So under hazards and wildfire, there are risks for wildfire with the sites, and it's site specific, but as you know, in the county, a wildfire is a risk. The best ways of reducing the risk to the extent feasible, of course, require fire resistant vegetation. For construction activities, we do require spark arresters and things to help prevent wildfires during construction, and requiring fire extinguishers on site during construction. I guess the second one is spark arresters. And then the third is really about structure location and again, trying to avoid the wildfire risks to the extent feasible, which means locating the structure at least 50 feet from a sloped hillside and doing all of that. But given the risks, there's no way to say it's absolutely, using all of these mitigation measures, we can reduce those risks to less than significant. So this is this would remain significant unavoidable after mitigation measures. Next slide. So in transportation, the transportation analysis found that the vehicle miles traveled for these future sites would remain significant because they would not meet the 15% below regional average VMT that is now the de facto threshold for the county. So the two mitigation measures that we recommend are a transportation demand management program that helps to limit or encourage folks to use other methods of transportation, and also to have a construction traffic management plan. So during construction, making sure that we reduce those conflicts between existing traffic in schools and other users of the streets. But again, you cannot reduce the future vehicle miles traveled to a 15% below the existing regional average. Nina?
I lost my mute button, my unmute button, so sorry. So thank you, Darcy. I will talk a little bit about how to submit comments on the draft EIR. As Darcy said, the comment period is open until June 18th. Links to download the EIR sections and the appendices that are included in the document are at the project website. Members of the public are invited to review the EIR and comment on it in one of these ways. We'll be taking comments through the end of June, the business day on June 18th. Comments received after June 18th will be considered in the final EIR to the extent feasible. Comments can be submitted by email via the interactive map at which you can also see information about individual sites and a map of the overall project area. Comments are also accepted by fax or mail. This presentation will also be available on the project website. And the next steps for the project are shown in this graphic. When the project review or when the public review period ends, we'll begin preparing the final EIR. And as Darcy mentioned, the final EIR is responses to comments and errata. We expect it to be published this fall. Decision makers will consider the project this fall and early next year. They will consider both the project and certification of the EIR. EIR certification is not necessarily approval of the project, but both will be considered in public hearings by the end of the year and early next year. So now I will turn it back to our chair, but I just wanted to say, so that, again, the purpose of this hearing is to accept comments on the adequacy of the draft EIR. We aren't responding to comments today. Those comments will be recorded and responded to in the final EIR. We're not necessarily taking comments down verbatim. So if you want a detailed, if you want your comment reproduced as written, please send a written comment, and then that will be reproduced in the final EIR. We're recording this presentation, so your voice will be recorded if you make a comment verbally. I think that's all of the sort of guidelines for commenting on the project today. And I will turn it back over to Chair Reed as soon as I figure out how to unshare my screen.
There you go.
Oh, somebody stopped me for me. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Nina. We'll get to some public comments in a minute. Are there commissioner questions or clarifications?
Through the chair, just before commissioner comments or questions, if council could just, since this is, it's been a while since we've had a draft EIR come to the Planning Commission, could you just briefly say what the overall process and goal is today, since there is no, action or recommendation?
Certainly. Good afternoon, commissioners. The Planning Commission is not scheduled to deliberate or take action on the EIR today, as you all know. Today's hearing is to listen to and receive public comments, and you'll have an opportunity at the next hearing to provide your feedback, discuss, deliberate as needed. Again, the comment period on this EIR will not close until next month. And so is not the appropriate time to be deliberating on the document at this time.
Council, are we taking comments from the commissioners, provided that there's no back and forth or follow-up? Or is it more appropriate that it's just public comment today?
It is best and cleanest for this process if the commission holds its comments to its later scheduled date. But if you have particular questions for staff about the document itself that don't wander into deliberation on the merits, then that is within your purview. But again, it would be cleanest and easiest for the process if you held your discussion until your scheduled hearing on the final EIR in September. Or is that October? September.
Okay, that seems clear. Let's go ahead and just take any questions. Commissioner Carr, do you have a question?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple. A lot of times what happens on these EIR hearings is you get comments on the project and the EIR all coming in together. And I just want to make sure, I'm assuming that anybody who comments today on the project, even though it may not be an EIR comment, that comment will be kept in the record and included in the packet when we finally do get to the deliberation. Is that the case?
Is that a question for Scott?
I would say that all oral comments today for this agenda item will make it into the EIR comments.
Good. Yeah, I mean, that's pretty much what you have to do, I think. I guess my biggest question, and this isn't really an EIR question, but I think it would help me formulate my comments later on. Is if someone could explain how the by right ministerial process works for projects that come in on one of these sites. It's my understanding that they would not require environmental review, but they are subject to all of the mitigation measures that are included in the EIR. I don't know whether there's public notice that goes out for these projects. I think that would be important to know. And the other thing I'm wondering is, if a mitigation measure, if a project comes in that hasn't either for infeasibility of a mitigation measure or has some site-specific impact that's not identified in the program EIR, is there some way for that impact to be mitigated even though there isn't environmental review? Are there other can it be a policy basis, or can a person who is commenting on the project itself, can that be a basis for the approval to include some changes?
Through the chair, I'll answer that last question, and the previous ones I think were more for staff. With a particular project application on a particular site, if there is new information that is discovered at a later time that that would make this CEQA documentation inadequate for some reason, then there would be potentially subsequent review on just that increment where there is new information that might affect either an impact that wasn't previously analyzed, or there's new information that would affect the final determination. So where I'm saying this clumsily, but if there is that kind of a situation, then there would be future environmental review that would be very focused on that narrow area. It would not render the entire CEQA process null and void. It would just theoretically be focused on that one issue.
So these projects, the EIR seems to suggest that these projects would not be required to undergo CEQA review. So that sounds different than what you're saying. And I guess, you know, my feeling about whether an impact should be identified as significant and unavoidable or less than significant has a lot to do with whether or not a subsequent EIR or subsequent mitigated neg deck might be necessary. I guess I'm just concerned that if a mitigation measure is not inserted into this program EIR, that decision makers may not be able to do anything about that particular aspect of the project when it comes to a public hearing.
So when a project or when a site is rezoned for, or if a site is rezoned for by right use and it is intended for a ministerial future approval, there are going to be very few circumstances where you would have new information or have to go back and look at it. But the idea with these is that this rezoning is based on, and the future ministerial approval is based on this EIR. So sometimes in the future, you'll have changed circumstances or new information that might cause you to go back. But in general, if a project is truly ministerial, there is no additional CEQA review required. And I'd like to defer to staff on how the EIR has been constructed so that in areas where there's potential for very site-specific issues, those are addressed directly on a project-by-project basis.
Okay, well, I'll put something together in writing. I'm not sure I'm quite understanding it, but I don't want to take anybody's time, any more time. Are these projects subject to a public hearing and neighborhood notification?
These projects would all still require design review, so they would follow the normal design review process, be reviewed by the design review committee. I am not sure what our noticing procedure for for all of those projects would be for design review.
Through the chair, we do publicly notice design review committee. Depending on the size and scale of it, it might be a 300-foot, might be larger. It really depends on the project and what's most appropriate to capture the area, depending on surrounding parcel sizes and what that buffer includes.
Okay. But it would be a public hearing, and the public would have an opportunity to comment on the items that are within the committee's purview.
But I need to jump in here and clarify that for design review, the design review purview is going to be very narrowly limited to just application of design standards. So it would not be public review in the sense that we are accustomed to seeing with use permits, where you're looking at a whole raft of issues. And there would not otherwise be an opportunity for public review or hearing.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Carr. Good questions. Commissioner Davis?
So I just want to, again, it's been a while since we've done an EIR, draft EIR, and I appreciate that we're here to take comment. And I know that there was a couple of letters that came in, and I just, it's my understanding that this draft EIR, so we have to update our housing every 8 years. And so basically we go through this process every 8 years of needing to make sure that we have the appropriate sites. And so this is, for all intents and purposes, this is part of the housing element for the general plan. Is that correct? So because there were some comments saying, why don't you wait? But isn't this part of that process? This is part of updating the general plan, is updating our housing element?
Yes, this is absolutely part of the housing element update process. We have to have adequate sites zoned for to meet our RHNA throughout the housing element planning period. So this is our first effort. As sites become unavailable, we may have to identify more sites, but we absolutely do have to identify sites in preparation for adopting an updated housing element.
Great. Okay, that's it. I just wanted to, that was my understanding. I just wanted to put that out because we had some letters, and it just seems like that might help clarify some of the questions people have, but thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner Davis. Any other questions? I just have a quick clarification. Where the EIR includes 59 sites, and you mentioned that this is alternate 3 with fewer sites. Have the 6 sites already been eliminated, or are you targeting 6 sites of the 59 within the 59?
So the fewer potential sites alternative was evaluated in the draft EIR, but maybe Darcy, would you be able to speak more to the alternatives and maybe why those 6 sites were considered?
Sure, I want to make sure I understand the question. So it gives the decision makers some ideas of alternatives. Nothing is set in stone, but the proposed project is 59 sites, right? And that's what we analyzed in the entire EIR. The alternative 3 was proposed to reduce or avoid environmental effects, and we found 6 sites had the most environmental constraints. They're the most difficult, if you will, to develop. Doesn't mean they can't. They have a lot of mitigation measures, so that to give us a range of CEQA alternatives, we proposed an alternative that had 6 fewer sites than the 59.
Great. Thank you very much. Got that. Okay, so let's open it up for public comment. I'll just remind commenters that we try to keep our comments to 3 minutes. Scott, will you help me time that, or would you like me to time that?
I can help time.
Great.
So the first person will be, and it will be 3 minutes?
Yes.
Okay. The first commenter will be Steve Bertelbaugh, followed by Vesta Kopstakes.
Thank you, Chair Orr. This is Steve Bertelbaugh with the Transportation and Land Use Coalition. We're very concerned about this whole process because we're very focused on wanting to have city-centered growth, and for the county, growth that is centered in the urban areas. To the extent that you have growth that is scattered around the county, you increase vehicle miles traveled, as the environmental impact report confirms, and you also increase costs to the county over time, because as you have people driving farther and farther in order to reach the grocery store or whatever it is, you have additional road miles in the network. And as you know, we're having trouble paying for maintenance of the existing network. Typically what happens is that the developer will dedicate these roads as county roads, so the county becomes responsible for maintaining them 20 or 30 or 40 years later and filling all the potholes. So we hope that this will just, this environmental import will result in a rejection of this approach to planning. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. The next person will be Vesta Kopstakes, followed by Paul Rocket. Vesta, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Thank you. I'm encouraged by what you're doing. Thank you very much. I did make comments on the website that I wanted to ask about 2 sites. One of them is the map just went away on my screen. Find it. The one that's next to, there are 2 of them that next to the Forestville Elementary School. I believe it's 1 and 4. One is the one that has the PCB site, and manufacturing for what do you call power supplies. And I don't know where this fits into your world of the environmental impact report in terms of there are PCBs in the earth and that it has been monitored at the school for impacting the water. That is an incredibly perfect site for senior housing, but I don't know what you are doing about the concept of the PCBs in the soil and how that impacts your ability to develop the site. But I would love to see it developed into senior housing, which would be perfect on a very busy intersection with right next to downtown with less opportunity for cars. So that would, the concept of the PCBs being the issue. The other one I believe is 4, which is behind the school on Travis Road. And that one, my concern is, again, it's a one way in and one way out. How do you deal with that kind of a site in terms of emergencies? It looks like an opportunity maybe to connect to Hughes Road on the other side. But if that's not the case, then you've got an emergency situation that could be pretty dire with one way in and one way out. And I don't know how you deal with that. But the other ones are perfect. And I really hope we get a skate park out of this. The ones across the street from the school, 3, 5, and 6, I'm just thrilled about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Vesta. The next person will be Paul Rocket, and then that is the last hand I see up. I have a feeling that more are going to pop up now that I've said that. So the next will be IMAC 2 after Paul.
All right, thank you. I believe I can be heard now.
Yes.
Good, thank you. I would urge you to defer this process. I feel it's significant both in the numbers of locations, in the fact that they're very scattered, as the previous speaker pointed out, the inability to be able to mitigate the vehicle miles traveled issue, the inability to potentially mitigate wildfire issues because several of the sites are near or in SRAs. And the fact that we can only provide 80% of the water right now, and we don't have a long-term solution for that. So I would urge that these decisions and these discussions be made within, in Sonoma, at the Sonoma Valley Citizen Advisory Committee, in Guerneville, in Healdsburg, rather than just at the Planning Commission level. And if we do that, hopefully we'll be able to get more public understanding of what's going on, and be able to appreciate and help you in developing the process. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. After IMAC 2, and by the way, Zoom your IMAC 2, if you could state your name, that'd be great. It will be Alice Horowitz.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
IMAC 2. Okay. Rick Savell, 499 Adobe Road, Pengrove. I just, as background, I worked on the last general plan update. I'm speaking singularly about the capacity of the Pengrove sewer system. Been a resident for 40 years and I've been tracking this. And through the chair, I might say to Greg Carr, you remember when we did the evaluation for the draft housing element, the general plan, and we did the evaluation. I'm very troubled. This appears there's no continuity between the second study that we did at that time and the study that's been put in this draft. And it notes that the water agency didn't provide any information for this study. The study that's in here relied on a II study that was very unidimensional and focused. I had mentioned to Mr. Sepler, I'd send in a whole bundle of materials, which I resent today, that did not make it to the consultants. And there's, again, we're trying to reconcile this. I've talked to Grant Davis, current engineering, past engineering, great Dave Grunman, who did the last study. And it appears this II study was done decoupled from where we left off in study 2, addressing 2 physical constraints in the trunk line of the system. And to compound that, when we did the municipal services review for the city of Petaluma, PRMD reported that to meet future demand, the existing trunk sewer line between Pengrove and Petaluma will require replacement. That's consistent with the condition of the system today. That was not carried through. We're conflating 2 different build-outs. Build-out in the context of its physical constraint today versus ultimate build-out, which would require replacement of those trunk lines for 3,000 people. The consultant copied and pasted that the PSC has an agreement with the city to treat equivalent amount of volume of sewerage for a maximum of 3,000 people. 2010 census population is 2,522 people. That's the population inside and outside the sewer district combined. We're evaluating the population inside the sewer district, which at full build out under the general plan should be between 1,300 and 1,450 people. If we use the factor that we used in the general plan of 2.655 people per ESD, at that time was 1,251 people. What they didn't note, they used the information out of the 2016 SSM.
Hey, Rick, you're at 3 minutes. If you could wrap it up.
I'll wrap it up. What's referenced in the draft EIR at that time was, let's see, 515 ESDs, but currently that's 550 ESDs, which equals 1,460 people, which is 10 beyond what our maximum.
All right, Rick, I'm going to go on to the next speaker now. Thank you for your comment. Next will be Alice Horowitz, followed by Bill Keene.
Hello, good afternoon. This is Alice Horowitz. Thank you so much. So in the spirit of alternative number 3, less sites being proposed, I request that the 2 parcels in Glen Ellen, GE1 and GE2 on the county rezone map, I request that those be removed from consideration. You know, there was a previous proposal for development on these 2 parcels. There was a lot of opposition. I know that proposal has been withdrawn, but there was a lot of opposition, and it wasn't just about the building color. It was really about the increased density that I think was going to be like 13 units, and now it can be up to 22 with a minimum of 16. And it's kind of crazy to me that none of the comments on that previous proposal are being taken into account with putting this into with the workforce, the housing rezone overlay. And secondly, Glen Ellen is very concerned about the housing that will eventually be coming down the pipeline with the SDC development. And of course, those numbers are not known, but it is going to happen. Housing is mandated by the state to happen at the SDC, and to not have that factor into the numbers for RHNA, I mean, I don't know, that seems kind of crazy to me. So there's my 2 cents. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you, Alice. Next will be Bill Keene, followed by Wendy Krupnik.
Good afternoon, commissioners. This is Bill Keene. Thanks for having this hearing. First and foremost, I just want to applaud you all for moving this along and really trying to get at some much needed housing that Sonoma County so desperately needs, and affordable at that. I'm here to represent the Forestville skate spot, and I just want to encourage you to keep the skate spot in mind. I think it can be a wonderful community amenity that benefits any housing that happens in the Forestville area, and would also request that if possible, as developers come forward when this process is complete, that you please pass along the 501c3's information so that we can coordinate with whoever is going to move forward on a project. Again, thanks so much for moving this forward. I applaud the work you're doing and wish you the best of luck as this progresses.
Thank you, Bill. So Wendy Krupnik, followed by Vicky Hill.
Thank you. This is Wendy Krupnik, live in unincorporated Santa Rosa. And I did submit written comments yesterday, but I have questions as well as comments from to follow up on Commissioner Davis's question regarding being part of the housing element. I know that the process for this EIR was started over a year ago. So at that time, I thought that this whole proposal was a holdover from the previous housing element, mandate, and not part of the new one. So I don't know if it was just carried forward and followed in, folded in, but that's a little confusing. In addition, or maybe as part of that, my understanding, and I could be mistaken, is that those RHNA numbers were old RHNA numbers and we're waiting still for new ones. I'm also curious about what the process is for any feedback, because, as one of the previous speakers commented, we're out of water. And I think that there needs to be, some feedback from our local jurisdictions to ABAG or whoever it is who's determining these numbers about what our water situation is, and in addition, what our fire situation is. Again, more sprawl housing in areas that are fire prone with already inadequate evacuation corridors for, as we've seen in the last couple of years, for thousands of people, seems like a lot of really bad ideas. And then of course, there's the climate crisis. And as Steve Brodelval pointed out, increasing vehicle miles traveled does not seem like a good idea and runs completely counter to a number of other policies and goals that we're implementing. So I think there's a lot of questionable reasons to question a lot of these sites and a lot of this proposal. And I hope that we can get more clarity, and I hope that that number of sites is reduced drastically as this project moves forward.
Is that the end of your comment, Wendy?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. After Vicky Hill, it will be Greg Guarazzi, who is currently our last hand up.
Hi, thanks. I'm Vicky Hill, and I'm a land use planner with over 30 years of experience in managing general plans, zoning ordinances, and EIRs. I'm going to submit detailed written comments, but I wanted to share several serious concerns today regarding the two Glen Ellen parcels that Alice Horowitz already mentioned. They are being considered for rezoning to the Workforce Housing Zone District. So I want to preface my comments by the fact that the discussion you had earlier that Greg or Commissioner Carr brought up about the ministerial effects, that future projects will be allowed by the ministerial process. And I think that's why it's so important, even though this is a program EIR, that we really need to look carefully at policy consistency and other site-specific impacts if we're indeed going to allow these projects to move forward without further CEQA review. So first of all, the EIR fails to provide any real analysis of the suitability of the Workforce Housing District to Glen Ellen's 2-block-long semi-rural village. I fully support housing, and especially affordable housing, but density and location are key. There are county policies, as mentioned earlier, regarding city-centered growth to discourage sprawl, reduce vehicle trips, and ensure that new residents have adequate access to services. My understanding is that the Workforce Housing Zone was intended for urban areas where jobs are available. Glen Ellen is not within an urban growth boundary. There is no transit to speak of, and there's no job center. So in plain words, applying the workforce housing seems to ignore the many policies in place to ensure good planning and protect land use integrity. The increase in density on these two sites in Glen Ellen would dramatically change the tiny village of Glen Ellen, and yet this is not fully analyzed. It would quadruple the existing on-site density of 5 units. The most troubling part about the Workforce Housing District is that it requires a minimum development density of 16 units. So even if the property owner wanted to do something that would better fit with the community, it couldn't redevelop with fewer units than that. Despite requests in my scoping comments to look at alternative zone districts for these parcels, that would still increase the amount of housing, but be more consistent with the existing surrounding land uses, the EIR does not consider other zone districts. And I do think that's a flaw. I do think it could be corrected in the final EIR as a means to reduce impacts and make it more compatible with the downtown Glen Ellen. The very nature of the workforce housing district is clearly in conflict with general plan policies and the local Glen Ellen development and design guidelines.
Vicki, you're at over 3 minutes. You could
Okay,
just
I'll
briefly
wrap
wrap
it
it
up.
up.
Anyway, I think you need to look very carefully at the design guidelines and the consistency with that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Vicki. So it'll be Greg Grazi, and then I'll do a final call for public comment.
Hello, Greg Garazi here in Glen Ellen. I'd like to echo Vicki Hill's comments and Alice Horowitz's comments. I think the blanket EIR process for this many locations is completely unacceptable and inadequate for each parcel to be evaluated and then granting the by right development without further CEQA review of each of these locations is really a taking of the community's rights to have input on these projects. We would just be reduced to having input at the design review level. And specifically GE 1 and 2 would destroy the historic village of Glen Ellen. It's one of the last little villages in our quaint county of Sonoma County. I'm a native here and have seen this county grow over 60 years. And to destroy the village of Glen Ellen with this dense housing in the middle of this rural historic village would be a catastrophe. So I beg you to abandon this EIR, break it into specific projects for each of the subject areas, focus on infill and locations within the urban growth areas that have the transportation, the infrastructure, and account for the need for additional water, sewer, and roads, which is not really be taken into account here, nor is the additional development that's going to be taking place at places like the Sonoma Developmental Center. So I plead with you to abandon this EIR process and break this into smaller units and look at infill in the urban growth areas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg. Dave Ransom.
I'm Dave Ransom. I live in Santa Rosa. I go to church in Sonoma. We don't have a housing problem. We have an affordable housing problem. And as Fred Allebach said in his submission, we are at the point of having to provide displacement mitigation housing for essential workers. We lost one of those essential workers in Sonoma on Monday. He was the mayor, Logan Harvey. And here's what he had to say. For Lily and I, as well as everyone who grew up in Sonoma in the 1990s, this place was the Garden of Eden, a beautiful town and valley filled with a community where everyone from the town doctor to the town grocer had a chance to own a home, to raise a family and have a life. When I ran for Sonoma City Council in 2018, it is this vision of community that I have always tried to represent and to claw back as much as possible. Since that time, Sonoma has gone through a significant evolution. As the town got discovered and national wealth inequality grew, home values rose dramatically, and Sonoma has shifted from a place of families and first-time home buyers to a town increasingly made up of second homes and empty neighborhoods. As a result, the middle class of Sonoma finds itself, as it often does in America, caught between assistance it does not qualify for and services that it can't afford, while the poor simply struggle to find any options at all. Left to the free market, the hollowing out of our communities will continue. It's unreasonable for the green folks to now say that we can't build within the urban areas that they have earlier had us legally define. That's particularly true when they have no practical suggestions about how to house the Logan Harveys of the world. We'd love to hear a good proposal for downtown working class, even middle class housing, but downtown is expensive and we haven't heard it yet. Indeed, at Monday's meeting of the Sonoma City Council, we also heard that when they talked to developers, council members hear that anything built market rate in Sonoma will most likely be sold as second homes or investment properties. So the other key for the county, besides rezoning these areas, is whether or not it can assure a high level of building for the majority of the county, the working class, the essential workers in any rezoning of county land. Thank you for being part of this process. I'm finished.
Thank you, Dave. Fred Alabak.
Good afternoon. I would like to second Dave's comments and also ask you to please refer to my full written comment that I made today. I'm going to read some from that. My call here is that there's a lot of nuance to this rezoning housing sites project, and reducing this whole thing to sprawl and growth and VMT and fire zero-sum game is an abuse of the CEQA process and misses out on that there's a lot of potential good for housing here. The rezoning sites for housing project is all within UGBs and USAs. The map shows all in already established urbanized areas. This is not sprawl or scattered. What we're seeing from the opponents is a habitual pattern of all land use issues to apply to the same rigid pattern of only the strictest version of smart growth infill allowed. I think CEQA is being weaponized here on factors concerning VMT, fire, and growth, and as we heard, water is next. My call here is for planners and elected to find a way to get to yes and reject zero-sum game framing here. Smart growth and infill can be reasonably flexible and include many of the rezoning sites for housing sites. My focus is on Sonoma Valley, and in particular, I'd like to speak to the Sonoma 1 through 4 sites and urge you to keep these in and not ditch them in alternative 3. Sonoma needs housing options. These 4 1-acre lots are all in the city's UGB, and they all have potential for 80 or more units. If the VMT from here is not okay, then the whole city housing element is no good, and the UGB law needs to be redone as well, which would be absurd. These sites are where development is expected at the same density as proposed by this project. And the owners have accumulated city growth management ordinance credits for these lots as well, for the same density that's proposed by the rezoning housing sites. So there's a reasonable expectation that these lots will be developed at up to the maximum density allowed. The infrastructure costs will be borne by the project, not by the city. And it's up to the city to annex and follow through on what's reasonably expected development. And so this, somebody's going to have to do the EIR. So it might as well be an alternative too, and not, ditch it and then have the city have to do it. Let's see, I think there's a good chance on these lots to get much needed deed restricted affordable housing units with the county's density bonus option. There's no fire issues here. It's more than 2 miles from a hazard area. The Sonoma average VMT is 4.2 miles for trip, which is low for the county. That's not an insupportable impact within the Sonoma UGB. As Dave said, this is displacement mitigation as much as it can be called.
Hi, Fred, you're at 3 minutes. If you could make your closing comments.
I'm a kind of guy who needs about 8 minutes, but I guess I'll have to stick with 3. So please read my comment. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Fred. That is the last public comment I see at this time. If anyone else who has not spoken yet would like to weigh in, this is your moment. Chair Reed, I believe we're done with public comment.
Great. So we will close the public comment. Those were great comments, and I guess I'm surprised we didn't hear from Terry Shore and Greenbelt Alliance, but we do have quite a collection of written comments that have been made so far. And I will encourage everyone to put more questions and comments in writing through, when is the last day? June 18th. June 18th. So Scott, that closes public comment. So I don't know if we want to have any questions or wrap up with the commissioners. Are there questions? Commissioner Carr?
Yeah, I would, taking Mr. Ransom's comment to heart, I would like to ask staff to examine, come back with any ideas or possibilities that we have that would restrict these sites to affordable housing projects. And because I noticed that if we just go by inclusionary, or we get 15 or 20% of these units affordable, we're not going to meet the RHNA. The RHNA requires 58% of the units to be affordable to moderate and lower level income. So to me, to rezone a bunch of properties that's going to give us a bunch of market rate housing doesn't do it. And I'm perfectly happy to buck my neighbors and other people around to approve some of these rezonings and get some housing in it, but I don't want to do that for market rate housing. And I guess that's my biggest dilemma. And so if there's some way through county policy or restrictions on mitigation measures or other ways that we could require a minimum 50% affordability on every one of the sites that's identified and is ultimately rezoned, I'd be a strong advocate for doing something like that. I think that what Mr. Ransom said is right on the mark about what we should be doing this project for. Anyway, I'm hoping there's some way we can do that, and I'm hoping staff can come back with some suggestions for that. Thanks.
Well, as a reminder to the commission, any comments made right now, we're required to respond to in the EIR. So just keep that in mind with your comments, because we will have to respond.
Commissioner Davis.
So just one question. If we are looking, if I recall correctly, we're looking at either applying R2 or workforce housing overlay if it was industrial property. So if we evaluate it to that level, would we have the capacity to, and this is probably a question for council, would we have the capacity to reduce the intensity of use and still be covered by the EIR?
Not without rezoning the site.
Okay, so if it was zoned R2, we'd have to take it to a certain, we could have the capacity to take it to a certain level within some range, but if we were going to do something different with it, it would require rezoning it.
So that is more a question that is related to the project that's being proposed as opposed to the EIR,
Okay.
but the way that
Okay.
the project is contemplated is that these sites would be rezoned. And so it's something that would require less density, and especially if it's in the current legal environment with state legislation, it is extremely, extremely difficult, challenging, and dangerous to downzone a residential or attempt to downzone a residential project.
Got it.
So
Okay.
in general, that is danger territory.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yes, Commissioner O'Connor.
So I had just a clarifying question related to ownership of the parcels that are being considered. I noticed in some of the written public comments in the draft EIR that people had come saying these are actually their private property. How does that work with determining what parcels have been, or what sites have been considered? And I guess what I'm wondering is if someone had suggested their own property, and then when this started, and then that changed ownership, and that person now is no longer interested in participating, does that automatically take us off the board? If you could just kind of clarify a little bit about the ownership of those sites. Thank you.
So their properties were nominated by, in some cases, by owners of the property, and in some cases, not by owners of the properties. There are a handful of sites in this project also that were in the previous housing element site inventory that were unable to be reused for the next housing element without a zone change. If ownership has changed since the beginning of the project, you know, we still, as far as the EIR goes, the sites are analyzed for the potential impacts of rezoning, whether regardless of ownership, because by being included in the EIR, there's no guarantee or necessity that the sites be rezoned. So the appropriateness of rezoning one site over another will be deliberated as we move forward in this process with the public engagement process, further outreach to property owners and neighbors and the communities that these sites are located in.
Okay, so any last thoughts or questions? I think we can close today's meeting. I think we heard some good comments from, actually I was encouraged by the various localities that we heard from Guerneville to Sonoma to Pengrove. So again, I'll encourage you to submit more comments, and we will look to be getting back together again in September.
As one final closing of business, maybe we can give one more opportunity to anyone who wished to speak for something not on the agenda today, since we did have one individual who was not able to speak.
Thank you for reminding me.
But it does not look like we have anybody.
Yeah, actually, that Rick Savell did speak on the item on the agenda.
He did return as IMAC 2, but I wasn't sure if he had another comment in general. So, but it looks like there are going to be no comments. So business has concluded for the day.
Great.
Thanks to the staff. Thanks, you guys.
Yeah, good job. Thank you.
Thanks, Nina.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks for showing up.